Perdón. Ayer le mandó la embajadora que salimos en el 8 de abril.
¿Ah, sí? ¿Ah, qué bien?
¿No le mandó la
No la he visto. A lo mejor me la mandó, pero no la. Estuvo muy bien. Muy, muy bien.
Una puerta importante que se mete en estos círculos.
Sí. ¿Podemos comenzar?
Parece que tienen algún problema con la conexión de Leonardo.
Porque es que ya llevamos 8 minutos. Bueno, pero puede entrar después. Es que me preocupa si hicimos a las 11.
Sí.
Comenzamos. Adelante.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all of you that are accompanying us online for the launch of this special issue of CEPAL Review that we have entitled 75 Years of ECLAC towards a more productive, inclusive and sustainable development model. And of course, this is devoted to commemorating 75 years of our institution created on the 25th of February 1948. But thinking about the future, thinking about the challenges that will be faced by our region in view of the present regional and global contexts that, as we all know, are quite critical in various aspects. The idea is, well, this is an issue that has involved our Executive Secretary, Mr. José Manuel Salazar Siriñas, as an invited editor. Congratulations, José Manuel, for this first issue. It contains 11 articles of distinguished researchers from ECLAC and from other institutions. And basically what we do here is to review issues that are included in the decalogue of structural gaps that the Executive Secretary himself has identified in order to contribute to the public policies that we have to implement to bridge this development gap, and also the way in which they should be implemented. Basically, what we have heard in various presentations of José Manuel, the hows and whys of these development policies. We would also like to thank our colleagues that are present here, who were authors of important contributions included in this special issue. And we're very pleased to share with you with our authors Alberto Arenas, Nicola Nigalini, Simone Chiquín, Carlos de Miguel, Ana Westmas, Jorge Martínez Pizarro, María Lucía Escuro, Daniel Titelman, and Daniela Truco. Likewise, we would like to acknowledge Rebecca Ruth, Luz María de la Ruz, Janet Sanchez, and others for their important contribution to this issue. But they are regrettably not present with us today. And finally, I would also like to make a special acknowledgement to my team in the CEPAL review, who have made tremendous efforts using their expertise so that this issue contains the quality of contents. So tremendous recognition to Daniel Favreau and Monica Torres, and likewise Sally Shaw for her cooperation and for the deployment of her team of translators, editors, and designers, so that all ECLAC publications are of the best possible quality. Having said that, And moving on to this activity, to the launch of this special issue, I would like to say that, first of all, we will listen to a general presentation of this issue that will be delivered by our Executive Secretary. And based on that presentation, which will probably take 20 or 25 minutes, we will open up a panel of distinguished commentators that will be present with us today and who are connected both online and present physically in this room. So we'll open up with the rector of Universidad Autónoma de México, Mr. Leonardo Lomení Vanegas, and we will subsequently continue with a whole set of comments by Dorothea Lopez Viral, who is sitting right next to me. She is director of the Institute of International Studies of the University of Chile, so that we may conclude finally with comments by our colleague Cecilia Vera. Cecilia is the officer in charge of the Economic Development Division. She's an economic affairs officer of that division. So, without further ado, I would like to begin with this event, and I would like to offer the floor to Jose Manuel, who will deliver a presentation on the general review of this issue. Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you very much to everyone that is connected online, and thank you very much to our three panelists and commentators of this special issue. As Miguel Torres, who is the editor of this review, as he has explained, this is a special issue commemorating the 75th anniversary, which actually took place last year, but this is when we produced the documents for this issue. And it involves a very important effort in terms of reflections, and most of them in-house reflections. The list of authors, as you can see, and I thank them all, are primarily ECLAC officers, but we have also included external guests. Rebecca Greenspan from the Brevish course from UNCTAD in October. Well, she has written one of the chapters, and we also have other people from outside ECLAC, where we find the article about the challenge of unequal revenues from Andrea Vigorito and Amarantes. And also in terms of trade and economic integration, we have invited Luis Maria de la Mora, who has also made an important contribution. This issue, or the subtitle, is aligned with the diagnosis that we are making and the type of work within our region towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable development model. This is basically the slogan, so to speak, of our 75th anniversary, working towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. Now, that implies that despite the fact that the magazine commemorates the 75th anniversary, it actually looks towards both the present and the future, of course. We reflect around the past in some of the issues, but rather than celebrating the contributions made by ECLAC, and they have been quite important, and I'll speak briefly about that contributions made over the past 75 years. The idea is to think about present-day challenges, looking towards the future. And the other aspect, and that is the title of my contribution, the first article, is to rethink and reimagine and transform, which is part of the exercise that we have conducted over the past year and a half since I took over as executive secretary. And within that reimagining, within that rethinking, we have to distinguish between the hows and the what's in order to manage these major transformations. So that is the level at which this special issue finds itself. identifying gaps, challenges, and in terms of how, well, not only what we have to do in terms of gaps, but also how it is that we can move forward, what are the institutional challenges or governance challenges, why things don't change in view of or in order to achieve the desirable scenarios. So we need to advance towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable development. Well, that is what defines the scope of this edition. So I would like to present the first article of this review, which I wrote myself. But the organizing principle of this issue is around this decalogue of gaps and challenges, and we will look at that shortly. The issue has an article about each one of those issues included in the decalogue, and that is why this is a set of very interesting articles that reinforce each other and that represent a vision about the development challenges now in the 21st century for Latin America and the Caribbean. The first article, which is mine and which is what I will present, and not in detail, but in order to give you a taste of what is there, and in the whole issue has 5 sections. A first section that basically refreshes our memory or provides information that are not knowledgeable of this, of the contributions made by ECLAC during its 75 years of existence. It was created in 1948. After that, it talks about changes in globalization and challenges for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is very important. ECLAC, from the very onset, its contributions and the impact of this institution have involved not only thinking about the challenges of countries in the region, but also thinking about the world economy. And that characterized in terms of trends, in terms of characteristics, both economic and political, it characterized the world economy. So it's an important point to begin by analyzing how globalization is faring today, how it is changing, because obviously this is something that has an impact upon us, not only upon Latin America and the Caribbean, but impacts all countries now that we have a much more interdependent world than ever before.
This is the
Then we talk about how we will characterize the regional crisis and how and it's not too much to say that this is a development crisis. And that's when we refer to the gaps. And then, of course, what's next? What should we do? And how to do this? And we refer to 11 major transformations for a more sustainable, inclusive future, and how we can do this based on institutional capacities, processes, social dialogue, governance, etc., all in order to manage said transformations. So, in terms of what ECLAC's contributions have been over the last 7, nearly 8 decades. I have a very quick summary of this. This is not a very long event today, but nonetheless, this is just to point out that there is one section that refers to the 1950s, when what ECLAC did was to reflect upon the process of industrialization and to convert this into a theory with regard to import exports, and then a characterization that with regard to the central peripheral model and the issue of technological change and taking advantage of technical progress in the 50s. And then in the 60s, there were assessments of the import substitute system, and then the creation of the Latin American Common Market. In the end, that was what we called compartments for protectionism, and we had to come up with a Latin American market to take advantage of economies of scale, etc. ECLAC in those years also significantly emphasized institutional reforms, agrarian, fiscal, and financial at the same time, and then fighting inflation as well. Some of the countries were facing serious inflation back then, and external imbalances as well. Just to quickly mention some of the key topics addressed during that decade. Now, coming to the 70s, there was a great deal of emphasis on the importance of fostering structural change, and of course, the impacts of the global economic shocks. There was the oil-related shocks back in the 70s, and this led to other issues, and then again, income distribution. There was a great deal of work conducting on peripheral capitalism and its dynamic inadequacy, as well as the historical structural method espoused by ECLAC, and that made ECLAC quite famous with regard to considering structural social structures and breaking concepts down into age groups, and to have a systematic narrative or discourse with regard to the economic performance of countries based on this structural characterization. That's basically what structuralism is. And then the 80s. The 80s is marked in red because that was the infamous lost decade, where we grew only 2% on average region-wide. Contrary to the previous decades, we'll see a graph where we grew at, on average, 6 to 7% per decade. And of course, in the 80s, the emphasis was on assessing the debt crisis, assessing the adjustment programs, how to renegotiate the debt, how that was carried out, the adjustment cost mitigation policies, as well as a great deal of work on analyzing the export industrialization process in Asia and the impact on Latin America. Moving towards the 90s, that was the period during which Latin America embraced the new development model, the Washington Consensus, if you will, what we refer to as open economy, international, and inserting into the national economy. ECLAC referred to the risks of doing this very quickly or too intensely, or not combining this with other policies. And ECLAC also focused on one of their key publications, which was Transforming with Equality. And ECLAC referred on reforming the reform, because at the end of the decade, we realized that in many cases, they were not yielding the expected results. Moving towards the 2000s, we addressed neostructuralism as a way to address the ECLAC structuralism. This includes 4 key pillars: macroeconomic and countercyclical policies, international trade, development and social cohesion. And then we saw the onset of environmental sustainability, environmental issues, and that's why the 2000s is shown in green. And that's when environmental aspects became quite central. And in the 2000s, there was also a great deal of work on the asymmetries of globalization. Again, ECLAC reflected upon the nature of changes in the global economic scenario. And then in the 2010s, ECLAC referred to combating inequality and the horizon of equality, including gender equality, the society of care market, and this has had significant impact. I would have to say this is one of the main issues. A great deal of work was conducted in terms of sustainable development and the strong environmental momentum, progressive structural change, and covenants for equality based on the 2030 agenda. Again, this is a very short summary of the key topics that were addressed in each decade. And now, the 2020s, which began with the various crises, starting with the pandemic and other crises that emerged after that: inflation, high interest rates, increase in the cost of international financing, so on and so forth, and of course, conflicts, armed conflicts, the Ukrainian war, etc. This is what we have seen over the last 3 years. So now, at present, and the review says, this is exactly what we're working on today. What is the current perspective adopted by ECLAC with regard to studies in the beginning of the decade? For example, changes in globalization, new geopolitics, climate change, technological change, and demographic change. All of these have an impact on the region. And again, repeating this message of rethinking, reimagining, transforming, because this is something that we have seen in many economic papers. We have seen many extreme situations and significant shocks that are unprecedented. And so it's crucial to be critical and innovative and creative with regard to policy responses. And so, again, we have this development gaps decalogue. We have 11 major transformations that I will refer to, and the how. These are the predominant issues of this decade. So, with regard to changes in globalization, here we have some data that will allow us to discern between geoeconomics and geopolitics. Geoeconomics essentially refers to how the relative weightings of different countries or commercial blocks or economic potential powers have changed because of changes in trade, changes in percentage of the participation and the share in the global GDP, and how structural changes that we will see in a minute, structural changes in the global economy have referred to changes in geopolitics. Here we have some data. For example, the US share of world production measured in purchasing power parity fell from 20% in 1991, 30 years ago, to 16% in 2022, while China's share rose from 4% to 18% during the same period. And in keeping with this measure, China is about to surpass the US with regard to the share in global GDP. Now, this has brought about a significant change in the relative weighting of China versus the United States. China has become the main trading partner for a majority of countries around the world, with 14.4% of global exports, while today the United States only represents 8.3% of trading partners. And then we have the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa have also surpassed the G7 countries in total production in 2022. For example, the combined BRICS GDP was 52 trillion compared to 50 trillion for the G7 countries. And if we assess this by population, the difference is more significant. The total population of the BRICS countries was 3.2 billion in 2021, 4.2 times the combined population of the G7 countries, which is at 774 million. And then again, the recent entry of Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and Iran in 2024 will increase the economic weight of the BRICS countries, and has also expanded the population of this group. So these are just some broad strokes. What's the message here? Well, the world economy is no longer dominated by the United States alone, as it was 20 to 30 years ago, nor is it solely led by the West, US and Europe, but there is greater decentralization in the network of regional economic poles, with blocks that are not only economic blocks in terms of economic and military competition, but with different world perspectives. Also, China already has an economic size comparable to that of the United States, and large middle-income countries are an economic counterweight to the G7 countries. So, and one can delve deeper into these concepts. We're not going to do that now, but there are several articles in the review on these subjects. In other words, this is the reality we face today, and these data spell this all out. And the governance architecture, however, in the United States, in some of the Bretton Woods institutions and the international financial institutions, have a different infrastructure, a different architecture that was negotiated back and defined back in the 50s. And so these are issues on the agenda today. Now, there's another way to address these tectonic shifts in globalization, and that is by considering the trading system. Back in the 90s, there were major commitments taken on by the countries to turn the GATT into the WTO and to play by relatively well-accepted rules. For example, when China entered the system, We expected there was only going to be one single system respected by all countries with a commercial conflict resolution systems commonly accepted, and that was not the case. So all of this resulted in major breakdown of value chains or supply chains, rather, not value chains, and some the supply chains and production chain pieces were split up and sent around the world. Now, this also resulted in financial globalization, which is an entire topic in and of itself. So, how has the world changed? Well, today we have a system that is marked by protectionist trends. We have seen the reconfiguration of geopolitically driven culture, geopolitically driven global value chains, the so called de risking, risks related to the countries where there are not so positive relations. And then we have industrial and localization policies in friend-sharing countries, rivalry for technological supremacy in certain areas, digital standards, AI, microprocessors, other state-of-the-art technology, and overriding security concerns. For example, now there's a great deal of talk about food security, energy security, manufacturing security, etc. And a system where interdependence is simply mistrusted. Interdependence is something that may jeopardize countries today. Another key topic with regard to the review relative to these transformations is that there is a significant discussion relative to the transformation of globalization. Globalization is not over, but we have seen that it is evolving. Individuals are less enthusiastic about the commonly accepted rules and other aspects. Security, for example, has become a key issue, impact on employment. And so essentially, we have come up with a balance sheet, if you will, referring to positive and negative factors. Some of the positive factors are that there was high growth, and I'm referring to the 90s to 2010, up until the financial crisis. So what was positive over that 20-year period? High trade and investment growth, low consumer goods cost, acceleration of the technological revolution, huge reduction in global poverty, primarily due to reduction in China, but in other countries as well. And the negative factors that created that led to a great discontent with this hyper globalization. And by the way, in '97, Mr. Rodrigue, who is quoted there, Rodrigue referred to whether or not has globalization gone too far in a publication, and Joe Stiglitz in 2003 referred to globalization and its discontents. And again, this is just to cite two publications. In 1999, there was a very famous meeting of the WTO in Seattle where they referred to the major anti-globalization movements, environmental movements as well, labor union movements. The people were worried about loss of work, and these took place in developed and in developing nations. Negative factors. There was no doubt that there was a large increase in inequality, an acceleration of what we call the premature industrialization. You have an explanation there of what that is. I'm not going to read that. And then unemployment trend due to impacts related to competitive imports and automation as well. And there's an entire realm of literature addressing that, addressing the percentage of blame that should be attributed to globalization, competitive imports versus automation. Experts refer to technological change that has altered attributes, etc. And then again, another negative attribute was increased vulnerabilities and fragilities of developing countries to trade and financial shocks, and then the financial crisis partly due to excessive deregulation of the financial sector and due to certain changes in the rules of the game for the financial sector, at least for a certain period of time. Now, the subtext is that there's technological rivalry and geopolitical competition that have been more visible and quite clear, and that have had a significant impact on the situation, changing the game. So what is the overall perspective, the the vision. Some refer to the end of globalization, but we don't think it's the end of globalization, but it is the end of hyperglobalization. That period has waned. It's over. And the review also refers to it would be erroneous, or at least insufficient, to characterize what's going on today. And there are many articles on this. Uh, it's it's important to view this as more or less globalization, or anyhow, there's truth in certain truth in all of this, and you can come up with empirical evidence. But in any event, it's a transition towards a new rules for the game for investments, financing, globalization, and these new rules are important and incorporate national security demands, development of domestic productive capacities, and new emphasis on industrial policies, job creation, and this narrative or this argument that we need to have just transitions in terms of environmental and labor issues. Again, rules that protect nature and the planet. There are commercial agreements that include provisions and clauses for protecting nature and the planet. In Europe, for example, legislation has been adopted. Commercial agreements are requesting the lack of deforestation over the last 4 to 5 years for certain products that are being exported. So this is overall change in the rules of the game. Also, rules with regard to safeguarding against the risk to the digital revolution, all the concern regarding AI, there are regulations there, and of course, there has been attention paid to the negative social impacts of economic interdependence. We have all seen that this is a redefinition of globalization. Globalization continues. It's just been redefined. There are many different trade indicators. For example, service trade is quite accelerated. In some cases, the trade of goods has dropped. It's not that it's entirely dropped. There's just reshaping of the value chains with some origin in Asia that are being transferred to Latin America. And this is an opportunity for Latin America as well for the big markets.
So what are the challenges for Latin America and the Caribbean in this sense? Well, we have two major ones. First of all, to successfully navigate in order, in other words, to benefit from the major opportunities. And also try to redefine that so that it's positive for the region and for the world. For that purpose, we need to understand adequately these issues, identify risks and threats, and what is very important is for the region to have participate and exert an influence on the different fora where this is discussed, the redefinition of new rules. So those are diverse fora, but some are very important and very key fora at a multilateral level with regional positions in multilateral negotiations to avoid unfavorable scenarios and strengthens the rules-based multilateral system. And this has to do, as I say, with rules in order to analyze the social consequences. It analyzes the international financial architecture that, as I say, persists unchanged as it was designed after the Second World War. That is what we are viewing in terms of the world economy. There are many other things that we are have viewed. Now, going back to our own challenges, we find a region immersed in a development trap. And this is not to exaggerate or to call attention to this, because the truth of the matter is that we face a serious problem. We talk about three things. We can analyze, first of all, a decalogue of gaps, or as a first approach to a region immersed in three development traps. And therefore, before we talk about the decalogue, one trap is low, volatile, exclusionary, and unsustainable economic growth. We have statistics and reports where we find clear evidence to support this characterization of the nature of growth in Latin America. This is not something novel, but the low growth capability has been growing, and we'll show a couple of graphs that illustrate this, and that is serious. And our recommendation, as you will see, is to place enormous emphasis on productive development policies, not only to increase the growth rate, but also to guide growth in a more socially inclusive direction, creating more quality employment, reducing poverty and informality, and also in a much more environmentally sustainable direction, which is what we call the major thrust towards sustainability that I will explain later on. Secondly, a high inequality trap and low social mobility and low social cohesion. And that is another major issue. There is enormous evidence, and not only our own evidence, but of many observers and institutions related to the issue of inequality. But not only inequality, we're talking about low social mobility. And when we look at social mobility, simplifying illustrating this in two pillars: a dynamic economic system and a good educational system that provides good schooling results. And neither labor markets are as dynamic nor are educational systems in a good moment in Latin America. In fact, there are indicators that we are falling behind. There is a high dropout rate, low schooling rates, and for those that finish high school, PISA tests shows that the learning results are not, or learning outcomes are not very good. In fact, in some cases, they are very bad. And that is a crisis, and that is why we talk about a development crisis. If one adds a low capability to grow with that, in terms of inequality and low social mobility, well, if that is not a crisis, we wouldn't know what a crisis actually is. And this, regrettably, supplemented with the third trap, which is the low institutional capabilities and ineffective governance. And that depends on the area, on the country, on the policy area, and so on. But what does this refer to? Governance capabilities, the capability to manage changes. And we held a meeting of ministers here in January about the need to remediate the educational shutdown and the negative impacts of the pandemic in this sense. But in actual fact, one finds little progress in many countries when it comes to education. And likewise, we could talk about other areas. And therefore, we believe, and this is a fundamental aspect, that analyzing these governance failures, these failures in terms of institutional capabilities and social dialogue in order to promote these transformations is very important. That is the short version. This is a longer version of that aspect, which is what we call the Decalogue. 10 structural gaps for challenges in development models. And here we find a direct connection with the review, because this decalogue is the organizing principle underlying this review. There are 10 areas of challenges and of structural gaps in development models in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in our review, we find an article about each one of these issues. Obviously, I'm not going to explain each one of the issues. This is an invitation for you to read the publication, but what I already explained about limited fiscal space and high financing costs, high creation of informal employment, that is one of the problems. How we can overcome that trap and how we can grow more in the future. All social issues there that you can see on the right-hand side: high inequality, low mobility, and social aspects, social protection gaps, the issue of educational and vocational training, which is weak, high gender inequalities. These are all major and very important issues, and regrettably, they involve gaps and important deficiencies, also environmentally unsustainable development and climate change, and all the increasing needs to invest in adaptation as a result of all the increasing shocks of floods, hurricanes, their impact on agriculture, um, landslides, and so on. The issue of the digital divide, the issue of intra-regional migratory flows that are involve many nationalities and many different formulas, the insufficient regional economic integration, despite the many years that we have been discussing these issues, and all this that somehow comes together in limited fiscal space and high financing costs. Now, that is what we call the Decalogue, and in the CEPAL review, there is an article about each one of these areas, and have a look at the cross-cutting area, which has to do with the house, complex governance and low institutional capabilities, and that is a relevant question when it comes to each one of these issues. What are the capabilities? And there we are talking of the top capacities of institutional uh, perspective and the different capabilities that institutions have. So this is a summary of the ECLAC, of the CEPAL review, and a summary of our present view of the challenges faced by Latin America, and also in order to determine what it is that has to be done. Just a couple of graphs in order to illustrate the issue of the low growth rate. There you have 7 decades. On that graph, the line is the average growth of the GDP per decade in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Growth was between 5 and 6%. After that, we have the lost decade, a growth of 2%, and then the 90s and the decade of the 2000, where growth was 2.7 and 3.0. But you can see how in the last decade, between 2014 and 2023, growth was only 0.8%. And that is why we have said over and over again that this is a decade a lost decade, even greater than the previous lost decade. And so the question is, what is it that we can do so that we don't evidence a third decade from now on? Another way of looking at this, and we published in the economic study on Latin America at the end of last year, is to have a look at this with longer cycles. So there you can find the 30 years between 1951 to 79, and then from the 90s to 2008, and then the last 15 years. And again, we find the same thing. The average for the first 30 years was 5.5% growth, followed by 2.7%, and now only 1.6%. And this shows that when we talk about this problem, this is not only a very specific issue related to the crisis in Cascade that hit us in 22 and 21, 22 and 23. The World Bank brought out a report yesterday that analyzed the dropping growth rates in Latin America to 1.6 when they had projected more than 2%. But we have 70 years of growth data, and we see that we have lost the capability to grow. And growth is not everything, but it is very, very important. Now, in terms of the other trap, the most unequal region in the world, and here the comprehensive vision that we are trying, well, which is very well documented because we have worked hard on this, but the idea is to answer, well, how is it that we can break away from that inequality trap? And part of the response is to say, well, there are 5 major principles that explain inequality in countries in the region: low growth and structural heterogeneity, all those differences associated to productivity differences among the sector or among rural and urban areas, the issue of fiscal and social protection policies that are insufficient to reduce the effects of inequality. We have had several reports on this issue, and this is something that we're permanently monitoring: the behavior of social expenditure, insufficient coverage, issues related to pensions, and even where pensions are insufficient, and so on and so forth. And therefore, these very weak social welfare systems that we have and the consequent challenges: low quality segmented educational systems that do not respond to new needs, I already mentioned that, and also issues related to regressive taxation structures marked a very strong gender inequality, and of course aspects that are political, sociological, and historical related to the issue of discrimination or human rights violations against specific populations. So there is a list. There are 5 major pillars, and what we want to promote is a comprehensive vision, and to say, well, all these things are important, but thinking about the future and about what has to be done and about how that has to be done to work simply on one of these factors is not enough. If we want to reduce inequality and increase social mobility, we must work on all these fronts. It's easy to say it, not so easy to implement this, but at least having an adequate approach, a correct approach, is, we believe, a step forward. So this is a vision in terms of the inequality, social mobility and social cohesion aspects. And then we have low institutional capacities and ineffective governance. And we are working in a more systematic fashion. Obviously, ECLAC has had already worked on these issues, but the idea is to make this much more systematic in terms of how we can improve the governance of public policies and how to improve those technical, operational, and prospective capabilities that institutions have, the role of social dialogue and the economic politics of the reforms, and of course financing. It's an important, a wide-ranging agenda, but we need to be clear on this, and that is what governments have to do in practice. In conclusion, then, of this approach, of this vision, and of this interpretation of this moment of our development crisis, we are sick in terms of low growth in this age of globalization, accelerated technological change, the digital revolution, and the era of artificial intelligence. And that is somewhat ironic because there is a tremendous potential as a result of the technological revolution. We are not fully benefiting from that potential. Now, if we continue along those lines, the risks are that we are going to lose social peace, and that is evident in some countries, discontent and anger, that we will be increasingly unequal and violent societies, to have hundreds of thousands of people migrating, and even the loss of democracy, because, as we say, democratic life is incompatible with a stagnated economy and with a frustrated citizenship, with no hope of a better future. So here are, as ECLAC, this obviously interacts with the political system and has consequences. And in that sense, working on these 11 major transformations that we have discussed, or that we will continue to discuss, forms part of what democracies have to comply with. What can be done? And here we include the 11 major transformations. A major transformation for each one of the areas in the Decalogue, plus transformation 11, which is cross-cutting in the sense that we have to increase the institutional capacities of the state. And there we find the same Decalogue, but in positive terms, in the sense that we must promote high, sustainable and inclusive growth. We must reduce inequality and increase social mobility. We must expand social protection and the welfare state. We require an educational agenda for education for all, vocational training. We must move towards gender equality and the society of care. We must also work on major environmental drive to promote sustainability and address climate change. We must continue to promote the digital transformation, safe, orderly, and regular migration, and advance towards greater economic integration, and to strengthen the fiscal system and mobilize internal and external resources. Those are the 11 major transformations. And to do all that, well, all that cannot be done without effective institutions of excellence. A last point here of this vision that we're presenting is that one of those major transformations is what we call the major productive transformation for productivity, inclusion, and sustainability. And for that purpose, we have a proposal of a portfolio of driving sectors. There are 14 sectors grouped into 3 aspects: industry, services, and the big thrust for sustainability. When we present this, we always mention the caveat that it is not all sectors for all countries. So this is an illustration, and all countries and territories must view this in terms of their comparative advantages and determine which of these sectors or others are important for them to work as driving sectors. But certainly there is a lot that is common to all or most countries. All countries face a challenge of in the energy transition, renewable energies, green hydrogen, electromobility, circular economy, bioeconomy, sustainable agriculture, a sustainable view of water management, and that we include within the society of care, because the society of care is not only the networks to provide care so that mothers and women can go out to work, but increasingly, as a result of demographic change, the care of the elderly, and as a result of demography, country after country will have a demand for care where most elderly, where the elderly will be far greater than children, and that will require investment, and if those investments are made, it will generate a tremendous, large amount of employments, doctors, nurses, institutions to care for the elderly, and so on. It's difficult to provide care to people, especially over the past years or decades of their lives. And that is a driving sector, a sector that for many reasons uh, involves major investments. So this is a proposal, and we have a lot of work already done on each one of these sectors, and we continue with a research agenda around these aspects. Now, how to do it involves capabilities, processes, and types of governance, um, the technical, operational, political, and prospective capacities of institutions. So, what are technical capacities? Well, they incorporate strategic planning with a medium to long-term vision in the policy process. Aspects such as the capability of an institution, a Ministry of Education, or a Ministry of Health, or a Ministry of Industries of generating comprehensive policies with cross-cutting approaches in their area of competencies to create and manage comprehensive information systems in order to support policy management and implementation, to evaluate the impact of policies, to strengthen the consistency of regulatory mandates, to be accountable in order to optimize public service and public financing. And what are the operational capabilities? The use of modern public management tools for budgeting, planning, performance management and evaluation, and accountability procedures, mechanisms to evaluate productivity, and so on. This is a tremendous agenda. We're not evaluating the productivity of the Ministry of Education or of Health, the quality of services, the efficient provision, and a useful use of expenditure to strengthen human resources policies, to increase professional, technical, and administrative capacities, and so on and so forth. And you can see there are also political capabilities, political in capital letters, so that we can have adequate dialogue for the formulation and discussion of public policies, public leadership, generating collaboration and coordination between different levels of government and different sectors. And as I say, between different levels of government, between peers, and so on, everything that is related to leading a major transformation and reforms involving laws, infrastructure projects, and also the improvement of services in that area of competency.
And with regard to perspectives, this is something, forward-looking capabilities is something we are working on significantly mid to long term. There's a lack of this in Latin America, unfortunately. And this is the ability, the capacity of institutions to be a step ahead and to anticipate mega global trends and to participate constructively in a participatory fashion, assist and add to the desirable future development scenarios. Now, to the extent that the countries have dialogue opportunities and conduct this type of exercise with the different stakeholders, that in and of itself is actual time spent well on capacity change, because these conducting these scenario exercises will result in a coalition of key actors, key stakeholders that would be committed to that type of change. And then again, support for designing and executing government public policies, rapid and effective institutional responses to crises, resilience to disruptions, and overall culture of dialogue that would be installed as installed capacity to anticipate and manage conflicts between development stakeholders. Social dialogue. The comment here is that there are different types of social dialogue. You have the labor type, carried out by tripartite negotiations to negotiate wages and working conditions. This is something that's very well institutionalized in terms of international labor organizations. There are what they call safety groups, but as far as macroeconomic and fiscal agreements, this also exists. That's a key area. And there is also dialogue for productive development. We're working on that significantly. For example, councils and commissions that refer to competitiveness, and then again, territorial dialogue and development as well. There's a great deal of emphasis on building things from the bottom up, from the local level up, in order to activate for activity. And that is in summary, this is the special issue of the CEPAL review that we are presenting today. So it provides us with a vision of the changes of economic and social development of the region under the new conditions of globalization and world economy. It calls for rethinking, reimagining, transforming, and also comes up with a series of propositions with an emphasis on the future that can help generate a new consensus on development and how to move towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. Now, we don't know, but at least that is the spirit and enthusiasm with which we are forging forward and encouraging the group of stakeholders involved here. So this is this entire value proposition in all of the various articles contained in this publication. And again, in summary, the key elements of this vision presented are as follows. It provides us with an assessment of a region mired in 3 development traps. It also, the idea that we also, and then studying this on a more detailed level, we have a decalogue of structural caps that really need to be overcome. The what? It provides a proposal for 11 major transformations in the region's development models and includes a decalogue of gaps, plus the cross-cutting question of how to manage these transformations or how to manage the transformations. This is essential. This involves challenges related to governance, role of social dialogue, and the political economy of reforms and transformations. And then again, the proposition, I'm not sure if we could call this a new growth strategy, but it is a growth strategy, and it's a major productive transformation with a portfolio of sectors that drive growth and employment. And there's also an article conducted by mostly ECLAC authors and others, some invited distinguished authors, on each of the topics of the Decalogue. And that's what the review essentially consists of. And we are presenting this to you today with the hope that there will be a plethora of 4 where we can talk about this, because I believe that this goes to the heart of many of the key challenges and aspirations Latin America and the Caribbean region face today and will face over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, José Manuel.
Thank you, José Manuel. That was a very comprehensive presentation on this vision, the vision presented under CEPAL review, and a great deal of information related to, or insights into, how the region will be able to address certain issues such as inequality, growth, institutional capacities, and other aspects that are modern but endemic as well throughout the region, that have evolved as the world has evolved. We have also seen that there is significant emphasis on institutional capacities, which will be crucial to be able to bring about these major transformations as proposed under the review. Thank you for that. Now I would like to continue with our agenda by giving the floor to Mr. Leonardo Levendi Venegas, the director of the National Autonomous University in Mexico. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you. Good morning. I would like to begin by commending ECLAC, congratulating ECLAC for this 75th anniversary, and commending ECLAC for this special edition of the CEPAL review. I think this is a very appropriate way to address this commemorative event by, on the one hand, reflecting upon ECLAC's past engagements as mentioned in the first chapter over the last 7.5 decades, and also reflecting upon the present and the future. Therefore, this is a very appropriate measure and initiative. Thank you. I would like to thank the Executive Secretary, Jose Manuel Sirinach, as well, and Mr. Miguel Torres, and greetings to all of you currently in person. This is a very well put together review. I think it provides appropriate reflection on the current challenges and primarily how to address these challenges and to drive the transformation. I believe the assessment on the 3 development traps currently facing the region is quite well developed, and it refers to the long-term capacity to address inequality and low institutional governance capacity that has actually not enabled the region to push forward with some of the necessary changes. Now, the long-term capacity to address this is also shown, has been pointed out by the Executive Secretary. And for example, by addressing all the various decades, we went from a high growth period where we had annual average rate of 5.5%, annual average growth rate of 5.5% towards a period with very low growth that happened to coincide with market reform. And that led to the Washington Consensus, and which led us to an average growth rate just slightly above 2%. And from 2010 to 2024, the growth rate has been average annual growth rate has been 1.6%. Now, I agree with one of the concerns pointing out how we are on the verge of a second lost decade that would be slightly more alarming than the 80s. So this is a very delicate point in time, which is why I believe this is the opportune moment for the review, because we have low, volatile, unsustainable economic growth with low growth in the formal employment sector. And this has been well pointed out by ECLAC. There is a heterogeneity in terms of the production sector that, on the one hand, allows for the coexistence of highly productive sectors with high revenue, coexisting with sectors that are marked by low productivity and low revenue. And the most dynamic sector does not have sufficient capacity to pull along the rest of the economy and to supplement what the informal economy is not doing. There was a model adopted by most of the countries, and they have left that behind. And for years, we should have grown more. We should have had more job posts, but we didn't. And we haven't bounced back from that. And this has resulted in having the most unequal region. This inequality has also translated to low social mobility and a low degree of social cohesion, which in some countries is wearing away at the social fabric, leading to high levels of insecurity and other factors. Clearly, there are significant gaps that need to be closed, and social protection in most of the countries is insufficient, and this is directly related to other serious issues in the region, such as limited state space, high costs of development financing, etc. We don't have the fiscal soundness that we need in order to move forward with enough state capacity for better well-being and welfare. There is also a lack of professionals to facilitate social mobility. And then other issues, and climate change is also having an impact on the countries in the region, some to more extent than others. We have seen prolonged drought, ongoing pressure on water resources. This calls for investments and investments in different areas as a result of climate change as well. It was also quite evident during the pandemic that there is a digital divide affecting some sectors. This was crucial. It is crucial, and connectivity was essential to keep moving forward. And the digital divide created a very difficult situation for many of our students, resulting in significant delays of many. And this is a gap that we cannot accept growing even further. We have seen that there are very many scenarios leading to crisis in Mexico. For example, migratory flows in Mexico. Unfortunately, at this point in time, there's a great deal of tension within the recipient countries, leading to hard line policies related to migration and insufficient regional economic cohesion. Efforts to move forward with regional economic integration blocks have not been sufficient. They have not been fruitful. And then something that is common to practically all the countries in the region is low institutional capacity and low governance capacity. Now, this is just the broad strokes of some of these structural insufficiencies and gaps that we face. Now, one of the important aspects of this special edition is that it refers to these 11 major transformations. I think Rebecca's article is quite poignant in how it describes the current situation, and we should consider that when we assess new strategies. I agree with her in that we can say that the hyperglobalization period has come to an end and that we are now facing what she calls polyglobalization. We have this new polarity, contrary to the 80s, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the USSR. It would seem as though, well, for several years the bipolar world changed, and then China has risen even further, and we have seen the confirmation of different regional blocs. Therefore, I fully agree with Rebecca in that we are facing a new period of globalization. We are entering a new period, as mentioned in Rebecca Greenspan's article. And this is time to try out new recipes and new production localization processes, or what we call nearshoring, which would allow the region to tackle many of the challenges and perhaps address renewed efforts for regional integration. I believe that the selection of sectors proposed to delve deeper into regional integration are appropriate. For example, the pharmaceutical industry, medical equipment, advanced manufacturing, etc. I think this is an appropriate moment to take advantage of the industrial relocalization process in order to begin a new type of industrialization in the region that would allow for greater technological development and secure added value for the region. It would also be appropriate to take advantage of some of our regional advantages and to enjoy the complementary advantages of each country. These are some ways to to get beyond this low growth and volatile period of the last 4 years, 4 decades, we also need to focus on environmental issues. And that's why there's great talk of environmental sustainability, inclusive development. I think I fully agree with the authors in that we need to encourage quality work, quality production. We cannot continue betting on poorly paid jobs with few comparative advantages that in the end have shown over time that they are not lasting and often lead to greater disruption and fragmentation of the industrial productive sector. We may have some virtuous cycles instead of negative cycles. So we would have to make sure that we are able to expand social protective mechanisms and well-being, and this calls for funding that would only come from fiscal reform that would be more redistributive in nature and in better public resource allocation and expand professional development. I think it's crucial, and I commend ECLAC for focusing on these aspects and its programs. ECLAC's programs reflect moving towards gender equality that and as well as focusing on the care economy. Care no longer falls predominantly on women's shoulders. And it's important for the care jobs to be better paid so that the population may have access to better quality of life. The great environmental push, which we have been working on for a while, I also think is very important to uphold sustainability and to address climate change. I think it's urgent in nature in many of the countries where the impacts of climate change are increasingly more drastic. This is an opportunity for investments and to spur greater growth.
The digital transition, well, I fully coincide. Today, more than ever, the digital transformation must also seek to incorporate a larger part of the population. We cannot increase the gaps that characterize today the digital divide, because we would still be creating increasing and greater social stresses during this cycle, which will require connectivity at everyone's reach so that everyone may benefit from globalization. In orderly migration and regulated migration, I fully coincide with that. It requires tremendous political will by everyone. And that leads me to support something that is also mentioned by Jose Manuel Salazar Siriñach, which is the promotion of the reforms of the reform agenda that the UN General Secretary has put forward in order to structure that in a better fashion. And we're talking here not only of national governance and financing institutions aimed at development, which forms part of the agenda, but also to achieve long-term agreements, and that this measure enables us to better organize migration groups. I am convinced that with an agenda of this nature, we would also be able to advance towards greater economic integration at a regional and world level. I believe that this polyglobalization presents a new opportunity so that we can be better present in globalization, increases the negotiation capability of the region with other regional blocs, and that is something that we must benefit from. And I cannot but coincide with the fact that we need a macroeconomic for development and a healthy and strong fiscal structure, and that I believe is something very important in this review in terms of strengthening state capabilities. We require more solid institutions, governance, and social dialogue. I believe that something that is very positive is not only to do all this, but to deal with the political economics of development, or what are the compacts, the alliances that we must promote if we wish to achieve these objectives. A good part of the problems that we face exist because in the past there have been conservative compacts that have hindered these types of reforms. I remember in the case of Mexico in the 60s, when our country was experiencing this period of high growth with price stability that was called by the Minister of Finance at that time stabilized growth. At that time, the government of Mexico thought of the idea of a fiscal reform in order. I am talking of the years 1961 to 1972, and this led to such a strong business reaction that they practically ousted the promoters of this. And if that fiscal reform had been developed in the 1960s, that would have given our country an economic feasibility that would probably have prevented the debt crisis. That was not done. And we faced severe growth problems. So I think that we have to build the consensuses that are required. And as is mentioned, that not only involves that involves the promotion of wide-ranging and inclusive social dialogues, and multilateral entities have to play a part. Academic institutions, universities, for example, have a lot to say in this, and we have to play an important role in creating awareness among productive sectors about the relevance of fiscal compacts that enables an agenda of ambitious transformations such as the ones put forward by ECLAC during its 75th anniversary. I believe that they are very necessary if we are to face up to the challenges that we face, and if we want to overcome these development traps that we find ourselves immersed in. I would like to conclude by congratulating ECLAC for this anniversary, to the CEPAL review for this special issue, and especially for this vision of the future that we so dearly require. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rector. Very interesting presentation and comments. Undoubtedly, what you highlight most are things that we have been saying for a long time here at ECLAC, with the need for taxation reforms that can tackle the problem of inequality, so that we may be able to promote a redistribution plan ensuring welfare and growth for countries in the region. In that sense, what is also very important is what you mentioned related to macroeconomics for development. There, the major deficit, as mentioned in Daniel's article, is primarily the issue of capital formation investment, and therefore this is a reflection around these issues, around the macroeconomics of development. And what is also relevant is the political economics of development. I believe that one of the steps that can be taken in future research agendas, even through this review, is this comparative perspective of development. And there are experiences on the hows and whats in order to implement these policies. And now, beyond this reflection, based on the comments of Professor Nomeli, we now offer the floor to Dorotea Lopez Giral, who is the director of the Institute of International Studies of our dear University of Chile. Dorotea, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I truly thank the invitation that was made by the Executive Secretary, José Manuel Salazar Ciriñach, and the Director of the review, and my friend Miguel Torres, to discuss the special issue of this review that commemorates the 75th anniversary of ECLAC. I would like to congratulate the different authors that accompany us today, and basically to congratulate you for this issue and for the reflections that you have included there. Undoubtedly, ECLAC is the most relevant economic thinking institution in the continent, and and to review its intellectual history, it basically involves analyzing the economic thinking evolution in the region that has been expressed in the public policies that have accompanied us to a larger or lesser extent. I would like to invite everyone to read this issue, especially our younger generations, our new generations, who will have to face up to this crisis that we are facing, and who are concerned, as is the title of this issue, of advancing towards a development model that is more productive, inclusive, and sustainable. We're commemorating this anniversary, and that enables me to share the links that we have had with that have existed between ECLAC and university, not only supporting us with joint research or generating information, but also with the intellectuals that we have shared with. And thinking about the comments of this review, I remember that the first issue of our International Studies magazine or journal in 1967 presents an article about development written by Osvaldo Sunkel, who presided the the editing board of the ECLAC of the CEPAL review, and who promoted the development program that we have in the University of Chile. And just to mention those that have educated different generations. We have Eduardo Carter, Ricardo French Davis, among others. All of us that have read Brevish during our education, and today that is mandatory reading, are always surprised by how much of that thinking relates to present-day debates and the need to implement collective actions, as mentioned by the special issue. Now, talking about the special issue itself, it's very clear, and the Executive Secretary invites us to rethink, imagine, and transfer the what's and also the how's that have been mentioned in this development that we seek as a region. This special issue reminds us that the diagnosis of the crisis of development in our region are very advanced, and likewise the awareness of problems in cascade that we face, the problem of growth, of inequalities, of discrimination, among others, that have different cycles in this region that shares a development pattern with structural characteristics and challenges, and which has been a region of peace where we have tremendous responsibility. The issue seeks in an orderly manner to understand the three traps that we find ourselves in, the decalogue of structural transformations in development models, and the 11 transformations based on that, we find the structure of the document. Today, we have a period that divides the field of knowledge, and what prevails is the logic of specialized niches and solutions by specialists that are not adequately linked. However, there are issues of knowledge where those frontiers prevent us from analyzing subjects of study that, because of their nature, requires the audacity of going beyond those disciplinary frontiers. And part of the structural dimension that separates us has to do in this issue, and that that is a sort of camera that is moving the zoom from small to big. And the Executive Secretary invites us to think about the region strategically, and it mentions that the task not only lies in the hands of governments, and here, dear Rector, I think that this makes special reference to as the creation of human capital is a fundamental pillar in order to consolidate development. That how requires a theoretical and practical dialogue, but also a commitment for a more equitable world, providing a better quality of life to people. The responsibility that universities have, and especially public universities, has to do with the whole scope of education and research. And thus, this is a new agenda for research related to the political economics of development. And that implies that we must all contribute from our own institutions and from outside. And Daniel Truco, in this special issue, reminds us that education is a fundamental part of social and inclusive development and presents a clear diagnosis and the challenges that we face following the pandemic. And the international context and interdependencies between our countries are essential aspects in finding this new consensus. So we are at a moment, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, that requires a turning point in the way in which we understand and support development of countries. As from the international sphere, as I was already mentioned, Revesa Brinsman talks about the polyglobalization, this end of hyperglobalization, where the international trade system, as we had understood it after the Second World War and until recently, has been reconfigured. And what we're concerned with is this aspect between open or protectionist system, and we're concerned with the paths that we have to follow so that we can leave the nostalgic feelings of the past and look at towards the future, because that enables us to redefine globalization and to navigate it successfully. For no one, the impact that many of our institutions are facing is a surprise. The World Trade Organizations, for example, because it doesn't have a structure that reflects the reality of trade, and therefore we need to modernize, rethink, and modernize our institution in the face of the absence of a regional leadership and the pragmatism. Uh, and faced with pragmatism, this special issue is a kind of roadmap in order to relaunch in the integration that promises to find an ally in ECLAC, an ally for those countries that need to improve the quality of the situation of their citizenship in a much more developed and united region. Integration reminds us of the story of Penelope, that famous song. Luis Maria de la Mola shows us that we have schemes that are aged and ineffective, that do not overcome uh, the problems that we face. We have reached modest results, as she says. And therefore, in her article, she takes us to concrete solutions and to have a more pragmatic approach in order to benefit from present situations of shoring the institutional architecture that has already been previously mentioned. Now, this implies benefiting from the present recomposition of the geopolitical and productive order at a global level to strengthen regionalization and be active countries in order to benefit from all this. And that undoubtedly requires the incorporation of productive development policies that developed countries are already implementing. And as mentioned, we would be left out of this if we do not undertake reflections such as the ones that we're doing today through this special issue. We need to continue to believe that we are a region that, following that major project, which was Halal, we were able to achieve a road of integration. And for that purpose, many articles work around an agenda and some issues and challenges of that. I highlighted that within our own perspective as a region with distinguished experts, we have been able to tackle the issues that deal with sustainable growth, environmental problems, inequality, education, poverty, gender, and migration issues. The issue poses different types of solutions to various issues, and I have paid special attention to that related to integration as a result of the instructions given by the director of the review, but I must also highlight the gender work of ECLAC and the work in around the international aspects. So we're also very excited to read about the chapter of clusters. When I conducted a thesis about cluster services, uh, it seemed that I was talking about something obsolete and without much reputation. And the issue of services, Francisco Prieto, as from ECLAC, the fact that he fully believes in that and wrote the first articles here at ECLAC. Finally, I would like to highlight two key dimensions that, in my view, result from the articles that regrettably I don't have the time to highlight each one of these aspects, but that I insist should be read, such as that of Janet Sanchez, Carlos de Miguel, Daniel Titelman, Arenas, and all the other authors that I have previously mentioned. And those two key dimensions are fundamental to transfer towards a more green, productive, and inclusive sector. And I refer to the fact that productive transformations take time, and that demands the development of long-term policies and processes, in other words, state policies. Indeed, the present productive development strategies of sustainable countries such as France, Japan, Korea, and others first became a dialogue with relevant ministries and with the key social and economic stakeholders before being translated into productive development policies. For their execution and implementation. Programs are developed that have defined budgets and clear horizons through a wide range of instruments. And that leads us to the second dimension, to rethink the state and to accelerate efforts for its modernization. As examples of that, we have many of the changes that have been made by other countries and the reflections that we find here. And in order to conclude, I will highlight the invitation for us to be aware of institutions that are here to reinvent, to rethink, to reimagine all these aspects, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, in order to apply a new generation of productive development policies and to work jointly as a society. Our task, as mentioned in the article, is to put chaos in order, and that invites our institutions not to lose spaces, so that our research do not lose the confidence of people, a task that we must support and provide continuity to, so that tomorrow we may have a voice enabling us to jointly tackle the major challenges. As mentioned in this issue, a divided region is a weak stakeholder in an economy that is highly competitive. The challenge lies in the hows, so that we can define transformative policies enabling us a more productive, more inclusive, and more sustainable development model. And this issue becomes essential in order to understand, to discuss in greater depth, and to reflect. I reiterate my sincere thanks and my congratulations to ECLAC and to each one of the authors for the effort that they have made in initiating, proposing, and in establishing a roadmap and an agenda for debate and research for the next steps where we will have to reflect and do something in favor of our region that is facing a crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothea. Those were very interesting remarks. You have provided a very good overview of this edition. Above all, I would like to underscore one of your comments. You said it's necessary to continue believing that we are a region. That's quite inspirational for all of us here today. All right then, and in order to move towards the closing remarks, I would like to give the floor to our colleague Cecilia Vera, Economic Affairs Officer from the ECLAC Economic Development Division. Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event to refer to this very special edition of the CEPAL review. I enjoyed this process significantly. Allow me to focus my remarks on one of the topics that seems to be cross-cutting and mainstream in all of the various articles within the review. In some of these articles, it's quite explicit. And in the executive secretary's article as well, for example, in Maria del Mora's article, but in the other articles, it's implicit. And I'm referring to the fact that we are witnessing the emergence of a new order, these tectonic shifts, as the executive secretary referred to. The slowdown of globalization, what we call slow globalization, is nothing new. This emerged after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and globalization measured as a coefficient of the global GDP has become stagnant, and then financial flows as a percentage of the global GDP have also been on a downward trend. But what is new is that relatively since 2008 rather, we have seen the increased use of the term fragmentation of financial flows along the geopolitical lines. This clearly was accentuated by the pandemic in 2020, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 22, and as Ms. Greenspan just mentioned, the efforts of the countries and the multilateral multinational companies to de-link their supply chains from the more politically isolated countries in order to make their chains more resilient and focus on national and food security is key. We have seen growing environmental concerns as well. All of this has led us to have shorter supply chains that are de-linked from the geopolitically more isolated countries. So this is what we have heard: geo-economic fragmentation or decentralized globalization or poly-globalization, as mentioned by Ms. Greenspan. But regardless of what you call it, this is a situation that we must try to better understand. And Latin America and the Caribbean, as mentioned in the Secretary's article, needs to learn how to navigate this with success. So what is the concrete translation of this new arrangement? There are recent examples in the region of how we can understand this new arrangement. For example, the Huachipato economic problems. There have been difficulties to finally close the European Union Mercosur agreement. But about these two specific examples, what is going on globally? How are the trade flows moving and behaving between and among blocs? At first, one saw that the more generalized approach or the more general perspective was that globalization was not going to take a downward trend, but it has. There's been a drop in global trade, and we figured that the rest would just settle within blocks versus between blocks. And in a recent paper by Guillermo Pilar and others et al., and several years have gone by since these trends started emerging, they were trying to measure what is really going on. And in the end, yes, they have determined that geopolitics is having a significant impact on investment and trade patterns. They have estimated that since the Russian invasion, there was a 12% drop in investment between countries versus within countries, and within regions it has also changed. And if you see these data, clearly you can see that it's not a sudden deglobalization. Quite the contrary, in 2022, the trade, international trade GDP ratio was quite high. And there seems to be a reason why FDI has resisted. It's because the flows were channeled through third countries that are the so-called connector countries. So the direct ties between countries and China were being substituted by the connector linkages. Now, parallel to the fact that China lost in terms of U.S. imports, Mexico gained that. Now, they have also, these same countries have gained a leading role with regard to FDI from China in Mexico, for example. Mexico increased 41% its imports from China. So just applying this across the board and going beyond the two specific country examples, it would seem to be that there's a significant relationship or significant tie between an increase in the presence of China in one country and the increase of trade ties between that country and the US. For example, Western sanctions on Russia is another issue. When you measure Russia exports to Central Asia, such as Kazakhstan and others, you can see that they increased, while also there was an increase in the volume of trade between these countries and Russia. Quite interesting, because although these connector countries could be benefiting from these trends of geopolitical fragmentation, we have also seen that there's a paradox that has emerged, because the flows that are being rechanneled to the intermediary countries have shown that there are major changes, and the other policies that have been implemented to reinforce supply chains are not necessarily doing what they're supposed to do. And so these trades situation could be having a significant impact on these supply chains. They're making them longer, shorter versus longer. Clearly, it's too early to see whether or not this will be a long-term trend, but it's good that we are keeping an eye on it so that we can do that, keep an eye on it. And this geofragmentation has also affected investments. We have heard that the dollar will be used less in trade, and that China will begin depending less on the treasury. We've heard other data showing that China has significantly reduced taking on U.S. bonds to reduce its exposure, but it continues to be the second most important holder of U.S. Treasury bonds. The UK has increased its role here. So one can say that there's not necessarily a drop in the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Rather, there's just a substitute of a demand from one area by another area, or one block by another block. And that, in part, well, we ask why. Why haven't we seen more of a dizzy linking trend? Well, if you look at the debt in circulation globally, the part that corresponds to the block that is more politically similar to China is 1% of the total global, compared to 80% of the US bloc. So China can choose where to invest around the globe, and there's a certain percentage that would be perhaps issued by countries that are not linked to either of the two blocks. And so there's a 4% floating option out there. The same occurs with the equity bonds. 70% is held by the U.S. in terms of global capitalization, 25% by China. And I guess what one can say is that changes are occurring, but they are not going to occur overnight, because the dollar continues to be a key currency. Now, with regard to the use of other currencies in terms of trade, it is true that we have seen an increase in the use of Chinese currency. It's the fifth currency used globally today, but it corresponds to 4% of the liquidated trade, 47% in US dollar, 24% in euro, 7% in yens, 4% in pounds. In other words, the US dollar is the currency that is still most broadly used in global trade. Now, what I wanted to get to is that very interesting changes are underway. Some, in fact, are slightly different from what we originally expected back in 2018 and 2022 with the onset of the war. And it's very important to understand how ECLAC has decided to address these issues so early on, and that continues to analyze them quite closely, and that these are part of the ECLAC research agenda. This is very important because at ECLAC we need to provide a conceptual framework as to how we will be assessing the country's social development policies, and that's precisely what ECLAC has been doing. Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia, for those remarks, for those comments. I think this has been a very pleasant moment, a very pleasant launching of this special edition that we've been working on quite a while, and we have finally reached our final destination. It's been quite a pleasure to have experienced this and shared this with you. We will be publishing additional editions of the review and other ECLAC publications as usual, available on our website. Jose Manuel, would you care to take the floor for some closing remarks? Yes, thank you so much, Miguel. I would first of all like to thank Leonardo, Cecilia Vera, and others for their remarks. Hopefully this is the beginning of a series of dialogues that will allow us to refer to this special edition. I think there is an interesting material for future discussions, and we're definitely interested in the feedback from our readers, authorities, from policymakers, from academia, and it does have a comprehensive approach with regard to the topics that we are studying here at ECLAC as part of our research agenda, and in keeping with requests from our member states. So thank you to everyone. Apparently 600 individuals have joined us online. I'm very pleased to see that. Thank you to the panel speakers. Thank you to Miguel, to the entire team, and all of the authors for their valuable contribution. Thank you.